This show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday Twilight show here on Teachers Talk Radio. I'm your host, Michelle, and tonight, my guest, Nick Hart, and I will be exploring the extent to which informal learning, collective expertise, and internal accountability drive lasting change in schools. And I'm so blessed to have had two amazing guests in two consecutive shows, and all my guests have been brilliant. And I'm just so honored to be able to speak to some amazing educators, and tonight is no different. So the aim is to examine the barriers to school improvement, strategies to overcome such challenges, and to explore why this is essential. And as usual, I always like to introduce my shows with a brief overview that will support the topic that we're discussing. And so tonight, the title of the show is School Improvement Happens Between the Meetings. And as the show unfolds and as Nick explains more, you'll really get to understand where we're coming from. But what do we mean when we talk about school improvement? And I'm sure everybody in education, you know what this is, you've heard about it. It's what drives the school at the beginning of the academic year or by the end of the academic year, whether as at the department level or whole school level, we're talking about or school improvement plans. So Alma Harris, 2013, a noted education researcher, she stated that there's a concerted move to raise standards in the public education system. And for those of us in international schools, also in the private education system. She said the aim is laudable. Few people would disagree with it. However, there is no clear agreement about what we mean by standards. Do we mean attainment or achievement more broadly defined, for example, and how we are to raise whatever it is we agree needs raising? So these are some of the questions she raised. But she also outlined that at the same time, there appears to be an increasing trend towards approaching changes in education through a controlling, rational, and technical framework. Now, nothing is wrong with the framework, and throughout the discussion tonight, you will get to understand that. But she said this framework tends to concentrate on educational content and delivery and ignores the human resource perspective and the complexity of how human beings live, work, and interact with one another. She went on to say it overemphasizes linearity and pays insufficient attention to how people respond to change and either support or subvert it. Later on in the article, she said, teachers are frequently treated as the problem rather than part of the solution, with the consequence that many feel disillusioned, demoralized, and disempowered. So tonight, if you're a leader, whether you're a middle leader or a senior leader listening, or if you're listening back to the podcast, we're hoping that you'll be able to take something away from this to ensure that teachers aren't seen as the problem, but they're seen as part of the solution. How to avoid the feeling of disillusionment, how to avoid your very valuable human resource from feeling demoralized or disempowered. And that is the purpose of tonight's show. So welcome to those of you who've already joined. It is lovely to have you. We look forward to hearing some of your comments or your questions. I'm going to take a short break. When we come back, I will introduce our lovely guest, and then we'll go straight into the questions. Do stay tuned.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. So let me pause to welcome tonight's guest, none other than Nick Hart, a gentleman, in my opinion, who has proven to be exemplary in the world of education research. I was talking to him earlier and I said, I've replaced a lot of my nighttime reading materials or whatever I watch sometimes before bed with reading so many of his articles because they have really informed my own practice. So I met Nick on the conference scene and was always in awe of his charisma and wealth of informed knowledge. He is principal. He holds an MBA in international education leadership. He's an author, educator, and an avid researcher, also a public speaker. I am honored to have read, as I said before, a number of his articles, and it's one such article that has brought us here tonight. And the title of it, I think, was School Improvement Informally. I was intrigued by it, as we often think of school improvement as something that has to be done with rigid and unflexible structures. So tonight we will explore what that looks like informally. Nick, welcome, and thank you so much for sparing the time to be with us on Teachers Talk Radio.
Yeah, very kind, Michelle. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Fantastic. So the first thing, just to ensure that our audience gets to know you a little bit more, could you tell us a little bit about your leadership journey so far?
Yeah, so in state schools in the UK, made my way into kind of middle leadership out of the primary classroom. I led subjects like English, maths, science, PE, a whole range of different ones, and then stepped into senior leadership with assistant headship. And at that point, I probably didn't think too much about the future. I ended up, I think, becoming a deputy head by being the longest serving and the one that makes most sense, just to continue into that without really intending it. And then I remember there coming a time as a deputy head, thinking about the whole school and thinking I would do things a little bit differently. I would want to try something else. And I think that's the moment for me when I realized that headship is the one. I think it's the best job in the world. I think having responsibility for leading a community is an incredible privilege. And so then head teacher of a couple of schools, increasing in size as I kind of went. The first school was a tiny school of 130 kids, and then a slightly bigger school, and then an executive head of 2 schools in the federation before making the move out to Dubai, where I started as a principal of a primary school in Dubai, and now the founding principal at Horizon Town Square, and all through the school that's opening in 2027.
Fantastic. So kind of a natural trajectory. And it's good that you recognized earlier on that this is exactly what you'd like to do, to make a difference, in the world of education. We appreciate leaders like you, Nick. We really do. So we're going to go straight into the questions. And these questions are based on your article, which I read a couple of times, and hoping tonight we can really flesh out some of the ideas. So we spend significant time developing strategic plans and improvement priorities. It's part of our remit. But are we overestimating the impact of formal school improvement processes? Do we spend too much time on that?
I think it's a difficult one to pin down, because your question, are we overestimating the impact? And I think the point of complex systems, which schools are, is that it's really hard to disentangle cause and effect. So when we see success or we see failure, the human mind naturally wants to attribute cause to that, whether it is a bias or a preferred narrative. It's a natural thing to assign cause to an effect. And when we've written a school improvement plan and the school gets better, we're naturally going to attribute those successes to the things we've done. But the reality of complex systems is that we can't disentangle cause and effect. For every action we take, there are probably multiple causes, multiple effects. For every phenomenon that we see, there are probably multiple causes for that. And so it's probably more of a question of the nuance around those two things. And I think that's one of the fundamental things that school leaders need to be able to hold in their heads. I think we have to understand schools are complex systems that are unpredictable, and where change happens through emergence instead of direct cause and effect. But we also have to put that to the side sometimes and present our school improvement thinking in a linear way because of the accountability systems that we work in. I think we have to be able to hold that difference in our minds and know when to switch between the two.
Thank you so much. I think that's important because sometimes, even for me as a head of department, we create our department improvement plan and we stick to it despite the changes that might be happening, and we're held accountable to those standards or those suggested changes, because that's what we need to get done by the end of the academic year, forgetting, as you said, some of the causes and some of the shifts in the phenomena. So it's so important that we review that. So your article argues that school improvement often happens informally, but you also said this is not, it's not on its own. What do you mean by informal leadership and informal improvement?
This is, I think this is fundamental, deep thinking that leaders need to do. And I think everyone has to have a concept in mind of what improvement is. And fundamentally, improvement is better outcomes for students, however you measure those, whatever you think they are, whether they're academic, whether they're pastoral, whether they're anything in between. The idea of nailing down what improvement is, in this case, let's say student outcomes. But then you can't improve those directly, especially if you're a leader. You're not in the classroom with children. So it's the switching to upstream thinking for leaders. So we have to think what is upstream of that. And so what is absolutely necessary for better outcomes is better teaching in the first place. So not that teachers aren't good enough, but every teacher can get better, to paraphrase Dylan William. And if we know that better teaching is upstream of better outcomes, we then have to figure out, right, how do teachers get better? How do teachers learn? And that's where the informal learning, informal leadership piece comes in, because there's plenty of research on teacher development and leadership development that tells us that the majority happens informally, not in the formal CPD, not in the courses, not in the MPQs, not in those CPD sessions that we put on after school and ask our teachers to come to. That's not where the bulk of learning happens. The bulk of learning happens in, as your title says, in the moments between meetings, in those chats in between lessons, at the photocopier over coffee. It's when you're driving home and you're thinking about reflecting on how something went in the classroom with a particular lesson. Those are the moments where the majority of learning happens, and yet we spend and invest a lot of money, as time and money, on formal CPD. We send our leaders and teachers out on courses. We get everyone in the hall once a week and talk about ways that are going to improve. But that's a small proportion of the things that actually help teachers to get better. And so that the idea of informal learning, informal leadership, informal improvement, I think we have to think of a continuum. Just like there's a continuum of formality in how we speak or how we dress, there are some very formal structures like long-term CPD, like MPQs, external training, and then all the way down to personal reflection and everything in between, from CPD sessions at school, or team teaching, or co-planning, or lesson observations, or sending something for your colleagues to read. All of those things are on a different point of the scale of formality. And I think we spend a disproportionate amount of time and money on the formal end and less on the informal end.
So, but why do you think schools tend to do this, Nick? Why do schools focus on the systems and structures and accountability when improvement may be driven by something less visible?
I mean, you have to have them. Every school has to have systems and structures and accountability. And I think one of the things we have to accept is that because we're responsible for improvement, we have to do something. Yeah, and we all feel like we have to be doing obvious, visible things. And the idea that we need systems in order to get emergence is quite counterintuitive. You need, so the minimum would be making sure that people interact with each other. If teachers are silos, if they don't speak to another adult for most of the day, they're not going to have interactions about teaching, not going to talk, think, challenge each other. So the systems and structures are around getting people talking to each other, getting people sharing ideas, seeing each other teaching. Those are the moments. And so we can often try and control everything. We can often try and impose a very rigid teaching, a way of teaching or curriculum structure or assessment structure, and ask people to do the same thing. And that's where I think where a lot of schools make a mistake sometimes, is insisting on consistency, people doing the same thing. But systems and structures are not necessarily that. Systems and structures can be the way that we create conditions for learning to happen in the first place.
Thank you so much. I often say to my team that I think structures help with creativity, because if you know the structure within which you're working, you're at liberty to push the boundaries a little bit and to experiment and become innovative. So I do understand that. But as a senior leader, Nick, and for a number of years, how do you measure the impact of those long-term CPDs, for instance? And then how do you then decide when there should be a time for the personal reflection? How do you manage that or balance that?
I don't think you can measure the impact, or maybe it's not worth the effort it would take to measure the impact of CPD, because at the end of the day, it would only have earned its place if outcomes are getting better. So we have to measure the outcomes, and then understand that lots of things have contributed to that. So we're all self-preservative, aren't we? If we're an assistant head or a head of department that is pushing for a particular thing, and then success comes, we're going to attribute it to that. So the measurement is a tough one, but we have to hold true to that idea of what improvement is. The furthest downstream version of that is kids' outcomes are better. But there are some other things. There are some indicators. There's definitely some indicators, and this is so in order for kids' outcomes to be better, there has to be a change in teachers' behaviour. For that to happen, there's got to be a change in teachers' knowledge. We can't do things that we don't know about. So a very loose chain of causality would be teachers knowing more, then teachers doing things differently, and then outcomes for children changing. I don't think you can get outcomes without those other things happening. But they could also be systemic. So an indicator of improvement might be that there are systems where there weren't systems before. There is a well-sequenced curriculum in place where there wasn't one before. That would be an indicator that outcomes are likely to improve, but they are only indicators at that point. They are just pointing us in the right direction, but we still need to check that there's actually having an impact on outcomes for students.
Definitely. And I think ultimately it's all about the impact on our students' outcomes, because we're here to serve them as well and to ensure that they're successful. You mentioned briefly rigid systems that create rigid ways of teaching. Do you mind elaborating a little bit on that, please? What does that mean? Is that having a teaching and learning framework that everybody has to adhere to, or?
Yes, I mean, you see examples of it all the time. So leaders will notice that there's variation in outcomes. Let's say one class or one cohort or one subject has higher or lower outcomes for students. And the natural thing then is to try to look at what another cohort or another subject is doing and try and mimic that, because look, they do this, they get that. So if we want that, we need to do it as well. So that kind of tendency to consistency is common, because I think it's a natural assumption for us to make, and that's where kind of those teaching policies come, where everyone has to start their lesson a particular way, or you need the slides to all have the same layout, or you have to kind of stop every 5 minutes for a mini plenary. All those things that are well-meaning because they may have an evidence base. If we try and just apply them universally, it's unlikely to result in success, because even you can have two classes right next to each other. Let's say 2 Year 5 classes, both with both teaching the same content. the children are different, their prior knowledge is different, their attitudes are different, their mindsets are different, their well-being is different, and the teacher is different with different subject knowledge, different pedagogical knowledge, different mindset, different stresses going on. And so even though you've got what looks like two classes next to each other that are the same, they're not the same. And so therefore you can't necessarily do the same. You can't expect teachers to do the same thing, even though on the surface it looks really similar. And so the whole point about a teaching framework is to provide some boundaries, some loose ideas of what great teaching is, and support teachers to solve those problems in the context that they've got. A year 9 maths classroom is very different to an FS2 classroom, and therefore teachers need room to experiment and to try things out. And sometimes maybe you need consistency. If a school is struggling, you've got teachers who are new, teachers who are inexperienced. Sometimes you need consistency in the short term, but it's never a long-term solution because it can damage morale, culture, trust, agency, autonomy in the long term. Sometimes it's a necessary short-term situation, but never the long-term solution.
Thank you so much. And you mentioned something key there, in my opinion, context. I think context is so important. And sometimes the systems are not just within the school, but sometimes it's taken or transported from another school, completely different context, and superimposed on another school, and it doesn't work. And I've seen that a number of times.
I've done it myself. I've gone from one school to another thinking that, okay, this is the best way of teaching English to Key Stage 1, and then tried to replicate it, and it can't work the same because there's completely different context. I've done it myself. I've learned that the hard way.
And then you ask yourself, but wait a minute, I did it with last year's cohort, or I tried it at this school. Why isn't it working? It's context. And it's so important that as leaders, we really become more sensitive to the context we're in and plan accordingly. Do you believe the external pressures, Nick, sometimes force leaders to just go with a formula and try to make it work because they just don't have the time to understand what they're working with? Or is 100%. There no excuse? Yeah.
No, I've felt it myself as a leader. If you are expecting some sort of regulatory visit, and you know that that there has to be a change in the gradings or the change in the judgments, that it's human nature to want to do everything you can to get that over the line. We're judged on these things, and so it's definitely in our minds. It's the external accountability is there, but it can't. It's not a long-term. It's not a long-term solution to running a school or a department. It's not sustainable. We need an internal accountability model, a less formal one, where we hold ourselves to account for the clarity that we're providing, and the structures and the systems that over time will probably be great if we're making good decisions, doing it well. But the pressure on the short-term improvement is real.
And it goes back to systems thinking. I'm a Peter Senge, as you should know, you probably know, disciple. Yeah, it's all about looking at the system as a whole and then understanding those component parts. Thank you so much, Nick. For those of you who are just joining, or those of you who have joined, thank you so much. Tonight, I've got with me Nick Hart, an international school principal, and we're talking about school improvement and that it happens between the meetings. We're just looking at the importance of context. Nick mentioned a couple of times the importance of a change in the mindset of our teachers, making our teachers better, and valuing them as a human resource, but at the same time, providing all the necessary training or whatever it is they need, whether for the long term or the personal reflections that will help them to improve their craft. Because if the teachers improve, outcomes will improve. So that's what we're talking about tonight. And how can we ensure as leaders that we do this? We're going to go for another short break, Nick, but during that break, I'd like you to think about, there's another article that you wrote, which talked about, and it kind of links to what you said earlier. It talks about creating these systems and practices as a leader. But then when that leader moves on, sometimes those systems fail and then improvement takes a nosedive. So I'd like you just to think about that and just tell us a little bit more as to why do those systems fail when leaders move on. So we're going to go for a short break. Those of you who are here, please stay tuned.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. So earlier on in the show, Nick talked about having a framework, but being able to be reflective and flexible enough to know when it's working, how to adapt and adjust to ensure improvement. And it just triggered a thought for me based on another article that I read that Nick wrote about why do systems fail when certain leaders move on, having established something that worked when they were present, but then takes a nosedive upon their departure?
Yeah, it comes down to, I think, the idea of what we think leadership is. So very often, in my personal experience and seen this in schools that I haven't worked in as well, is that when schools get better, the attribution is to people. You've got a heroic leader, you've got a great team, you've got the people that are indispensable to the school. And that quite often is the case because people get really good. Some people get really good at managing the uncertainty of a school that hasn't quite got the right systems. So if you've got, you could have for example, you could have a poorly designed curriculum, but teachers who are really good at making that work because they are they're making decisions in the moment, they're adapting as they go, but that the quality isn't baked into the curriculum in the first place. So you could have a department where there's great outcomes, but the head of department moves on, and with them goes all that institutional knowledge of what they were actually doing compared to what's on the servers in terms of the plans. Similar with things like pastoral safeguarding inclusion, that kind of thing. You can have a Senko or a head of inclusion who holds everything in their head because they are immersed in kind of the inclusive practice. And without them, if things aren't systematized, if there's nothing written down, if there's no structures, no cycles, that's easy to then lose that because the people could have been holding up the system. And so the idea is we come to rely on individuals if the systems aren't right in the first place.
Yeah. Is that a flaw in leadership practices, or is it just an oversight?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I think there's an argument that school leadership is far more complex these days than it has ever been. And I don't know I don't know whether that's true or not. But I can say as a school leader for a number of years and a principal now, it is complex work. There's that people need clarity, they need certainty, they need structures. We need these things as humans. We need the familiarity of knowing what's happening. But then schools are complex as well, and things change. So it's easy to, especially if you are in an established school that is stable, you could have 80% of the staff carrying what systems aren't doing. And then turnover reveals little bits here and there about how individuals were carrying it. It is the reality, and I think it's our job to future-proof our schools so it doesn't happen. A great schools, all of our schools are going to be there long after we've all left. They were there long before we all joined. So the custodianship of a school is to help it keep going and to leave it better than you found it, so that it carries on years after we've gone.
Yeah, totally agree. So we're going to talk a little bit now about informal learning. And in the article, you noted that research suggests that up to 75% of teacher learning is informal. That's a lot. Why is this so often overlooked in professional development programs, if that's the case?
In Graham Nuttall's book, The Hidden Lives of Learners, he studied kids for over a long period of time, and one of the findings was that in any lesson, a significant portion of what's being taught kids already know, but the problem is that they all know a different bit of it. So that variation in prior knowledge in students in school, we know it to be huge. Why would that be any different to teachers? When you collect 50, 60, 70 teachers of different subjects, different ages together, the variation in their prior knowledge, their skill set, their attitudes, their mindsets is going to be huge. So when we try and design formal learning for a heterogeneous group like that, there's no way it's going to land. You're going to have teachers who don't know what you're talking about. You're going to have teachers who've heard it all before, and everything in between. So that formal structure can't work at scale. It can't, because improvement in teaching is much closer to the classroom than that. In my opinion, I think teachers want to know what I'm doing, how I can teach tomorrow's lesson better, not something that's quite abstract and disjointed from kind of what they actually have to do every day. Teaching is a difficult thing to improve in. It's always like the analogy with sport, isn't there, where you can train for something and then perform, but we never get that training opportunity. It's always performance, and so finding what it is that would help that, like in that marginal gain of 1% tomorrow, is far more valuable than an elaborate presentation on the science of learning that is disconnected to what we want them to do tomorrow.
Thank you. This kind of links to something I discussed in the last program with David, and we talked about observations and feedback, and that the observer learns more than the person being observed.
Definitely.
And he was suggesting that it's time to get teachers into each other's classrooms to observe each other and to learn from each other. And
Definitely.
for me, that informal learning, Nick, is a teacher coming into my office and going, "Oh, Michelle, I just tried this technique to teach Othello, and I created this graph, and I got the students to plot this along." And the excitement of that and the joy in that, rather than sitting in a CPD telling you how to do it, and that discovery, through learning and through trying something and sharing it with the team and passing on those ideas. I think I definitely agree. And I think it is so powerful. Now, I did my teacher training many, many moons ago, Nick. I'm sure you probably heard me talk about this, but this is back in the 90s, okay? And so all the things that I've learned over the years, is majority of it, I must admit, it's through the informal process where I learn from other colleagues and I get new ideas and build on that. I do a summer camp every summer. I work as director of studies for the EFL department. And after every summer I come back, my department can be guaranteed that I'm going to pass on some new thing that I've picked up, and it's all through informal learning. So I really do love that. And I really hope that schools begin to see the value in that and appreciate it more.
Definitely.
And that we don't always have to spend hundreds of dirhams or dollars or pounds on CPDs, because you know what, Nick, sometimes we've got the expertise right there in the room.
You have, and you've got expert teachers in every school. And that example you gave of kind of an innovation on teaching a specific concept in Othello, there's no way you can be that specific in a formal CPD program. You can't.
No.
And that's the power of informal learning. It's what's relevant right now. And then the reinforcement of that attitude of innovation, the kind of the recognition, the praise, the gratitude that comes with the teacher doing that reinforces that cycle. You try and get more of it, and that's what creating the conditions for informal learning is. You're encouraging that trial and error, that innovation. It's a great way to develop teachers.
Yeah. And I think you've answered the next question, which is what kinds of learning are teachers acquiring informally that formal CPD cannot easily provide? And I think you've just hinted to that just now. If you want to expand on that, that would be great, Nick.
I think there's some interesting other parts, because what teachers pick up from each other is we can't control that. You can put 5 people in a classroom watching another teacher. They all pick up different things. One of them will pick up how well the display looks. One of them will pick up how they responded to a child who wasn't concentrating. One of them will pick up an idea in a book that they're flicking through. So you can't control what people pay attention to, and so sometimes the informal learning is around things that we have no idea are problems, or even things like efficiency. So I've seen brilliant co-planning meetings where a teacher's doing some planning and they do a shortcut on a keyboard, and then the other teacher goes, "What did you just do there?" And then it saved them time. So like even stuff like that can affect workload. It can affect time spent on things, and therefore freeing up time for relaxation or being fresh for the next day. They all have a contribution to the quality of teaching, even though it might seem small and insignificant in the moment. They all contribute.
Yeah, it's the little things that sometimes make the biggest difference, you know. And I, to be honest, Nick, I sometimes learn these things from my very own students.
Yes.
You know, they go, "Miss, why are you doing that?" "Just to control S."
Yes.
Right. So yeah, the learning continues. So
Absolutely.
how can school leaders therefore create these conditions where meaningful professional learning emerges naturally through everyday interactions? Is this down to school leadership, or is it individual teachers who should create the conditions?
I think it's but I think if we've got barriers to it happening, we've got to remove them. If people aren't interacting, mixing, talking about teaching and learning, then that informal learning isn't going to happen. So we have to advocate, model, encourage mixing, conversation, that kind of thing, but also remove barriers to it happening. Why are people not doing it? Is it because the staff room's terrible, nobody goes there? Is it because nobody's got time because of the timetable? Is it because they've got 2 ECAs after school and then they want to get marking books and then get home to family? Look, we have to look at what's stopping mixing and conversation and try and remove those barriers and encourage it to happen. Another part is how we talk about it is part of the job. A great teacher evolves, a great teacher adapts, a great teacher recognizes when something isn't quite working and does something different in order to get better outcomes for students. And we have to position that as part of the job. CPD isn't walking along to the hall on a Tuesday after school and sitting through a presentation. It's not that. It's solving the problems you've got in front of you for the betterment of the children that you're teaching. And then trust that none of this will happen if people don't trust each other. If they don't trust each other to take risks, if they are frowned upon for taking a risk. Imagine that teacher came to you and said, I tried an emotion graph with Othello, and you said, "That wasn't the plan. Why'd you do that?" that fuels innovation immediately, and then that person won't do it. They won't do it again, or they won't tell you about it. Either way, it doesn't work. So the whole idea of trusting relationships, professional risk taking, and healthy challenge of ideas is absolutely necessary for any of this to happen.
I love that, because in the other question I was going to talk about, you know, what role do trust, vulnerability, and belonging play in fostering a culture of informal learning? And you've just answered that, is allowing people to be able to share these ideas without feeling judged. And as you said, go, sorry, stick to the plan. I really love it when teachers come and share these amazing ideas and show the impact of it. And I often encourage them to go and share it on platforms like LinkedIn and say, go, let other people see that. This is brilliant. So yeah, that is so key. So those of you who've just joined, welcome to tonight's show. We're talking about the power of informal learning through developing school improvement and looking at what happens between the meetings. And one of the things Nick and I have been talking about is the informal learning of our teachers and what that looks like, and how potent it is when we give teachers the freedom to learn from each other and, to learn from other sources as well. And we're not saying CPDs aren't important, but we're saying they need to be a little bit more intentional. And so before we take a break for the news, Nick, let's talk about accountability and improvement. So in the article, you distinguished between external accountability and internal accountability. Why is this distinction so important?
Yeah, we're all under pressure for external accountability measures, whether that's students achieving certain grades, or whether it's inspection judgments or kind of stakeholder survey responses, that kind of thing. So we have those, and we need to demonstrate success towards them. That's just the game of school accountability. But if we're driven by those, you get a really incoherent or you can get a really incoherent and skewed school experience. It's like an analogy would be teaching to the test. If you're just teaching students how to pass a test, do they really get a well-rounded education, great conceptual understanding, links between ideas and subjects, like deep thinking? Maybe not. And the antidote to that is really clear internal accountability, holding ourselves to account for the upstream things. And we have to have clear educational goals that everyone understands, not be outstanding, because that's related to external accountability. We need, and that doesn't help the maths teacher of year 9 on a Friday understand what to do to help get better outcomes for their students. So we need precise educational goals that are relevant to the teachers, to different teachers in different places. And that precision is really important. It's not prescription. We have to be really good at saying what good looks like, or what good can look like, without being prescriptive. It's a tough challenge.
Yeah. So we're having a kind of a Inspector Calls moment, Nick, where as soon as I talked about accountability, the doorbell rang. So that was so well timed. I don't know if you know the play. I don't know if you know the play.
A little bit.
And Inspector Calls. As soon as Mr. Burling was talking about responsibility and accountability, the doorbell rang, because the inspector was coming to probe and to ask and to make sure they understood. But I hope everything is okay at your end. And okay. Thank you so much for making that distinction between both, or telling us why they're important. In the article, you noted that Richard Elmore argued that internal accountability shapes how schools respond to external pressures. And I think that is a given. But what does this look like in practice? I actually love that bit. I think I double highlighted that bit. Internal accountability shapes how schools respond to external pressures. But what does that look like in practice, in your opinion?
I think so. Looking at a non-example and an example. So let's say that we have low internal accountability. So the way that we look at external pressures is that it is the be all and end all. That it drives everything. The inspection framework drives what you do. The numbers that you need in order to kind of meet those judgment criteria drive what you do. And when you're led by that, it can easily be fragmented. So our response to external pressures with low internal accountability is very superficial. It's very it's very downstream focused. Whereas if higher internal accountability brings with it confidence, because if you look at any inspection framework or any standard of student achievement anywhere in the world, you can get those things by holding yourselves to a higher standard than the framework does, by having a really clear educational purpose, knowing what you stand for, getting the systems right for people to understand it. That coherence that you get, and there are many ways to do it. We've all worked in multiple schools that are really different but equally great. So there are loads of ways to do it. And if you have like a strong internal identity, we hold ourselves to account for our own direction that isn't dictated by a framework or numbers, then any inspection framework, you're going to be fine. You've got to understand the framework and understand what you're being judged on, but you're far more likely to have long-term success and sustainable success with that internal accountability right, as opposed to being driven by what's written in inspection frameworks or what's written in standards that schools must achieve at different age points.
And Nick, wouldn't it be lovely if we're able to establish this ideally? And when we have an impending inspection, that colleagues or teachers, leaders would just feel so relaxed because these internal systems, and you said internal identity, are so established that it doesn't matter who comes in, when, how often, you are just always meeting the same standards because of the systems. That would be amazing, because often, as you know, when there's an inspection and from the perspective of a teacher, classroom teacher, it can become overwhelming and burdensome, and the fear of being judged, the fear of letting down the school. But you're right, if we've got the coherence, the trust, the consistency, and that internal identity, then it should lighten the load.
Yeah, we've all been in that situation, right, where we're doing something because of the inspection. We're doing it as we're doing this lesson because of an inspection, or we're kind of doing that extra check for understanding because there's an inspector in the room. We're doing it for the right reasons in the first place, and we're diligent, and and we've got systems to do it at scale. Then the inspection is going to be fine. I think that on that one about kind of inspection, if there's incoherent teaching, that's a leadership issue. And I've always said to teachers in our inspections over the many years that if there are if you're doing great things in the classroom, great. If what you're doing isn't working, that's us. That's the leadership of teaching and learning and curriculum that is hindering that. So we have to own that. It's not on individual teachers to make up for a lack of system or a lack of internal accountability, identity. If teachers are having to manage that, then we're doing something wrong as leaders.
That is something I think, Nick, all leaders should really, those who are listening, or if you listen back, I think this is something you should take on board, that at some point you have to take some ownership if there is, Nick described it as incoherent teaching. But as I said in the introduction, often teachers are blamed for these inconsistencies. But it's okay, to reflect and to be introspective and think, where have we gone wrong, or what can we do to improve these standards? So Nick, I was when we were talking about inspections and how we do things because we're being inspected, and I was thinking, with this Gen Z generation, we wouldn't get away with it too much these days, because they will ask, Miss, why are you being so nice? or we've never done that before.
Yeah, or we did this lesson yesterday.
Oh, we did. That was, they're forgetting that the secret, that was our secret. That was a trial lesson. Today we're perfecting it. Yeah. So it's so important that these things are embedded in practice. So, you talked about leaders taking some ownership, but how can leaders then promote accountability while maintaining agency, trust, and professional autonomy? And also showing their own vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult line to tread, because you've got to provide some direction as leaders. You've got to provide a curriculum. You've got to provide some sort of direction on what great teaching means here, and how you do inclusion, and what you do when behavior is great and when it's not. There has to be some kind of direction, but schools at different stages of development can do it in different ways. So if there's a school that's in a bit of trouble, needs to turn around, the boundaries that you give people have to be smaller, a smaller range of variation. No, let's all do this for a short period of time just to steady the ship for a bit. But as a school becomes more mature, teachers have to understand the school that they're in, and if a school is more mature, if there's kind of greater shared understanding, then the boundaries can widen. You can encourage more stepping outside of those boundaries, and in like in your Othello example, to encourage that to happen a little bit more. And so we can't take a fixed idea of autonomy and consistency. Different situations require different approaches, and sometimes there is a need for tighter control, and sometimes you don't need it. But it comes down to leaders understanding and helping teachers and middle leaders to understand the problem you're trying to solve, and to understand that there are multiple ways of tackling those problems, but also to make sure people know enough to be able to make decisions about that. So we can only solve problems with what we know, and if we don't know the science of great teaching, or what inclusive practice is, or how to manage difficult behavior, then we're going to make bad decisions about it. So it's our job as leaders to make sure people know enough to make good decisions about the problems they're solving in the first place. It's not an easy, there's no quick fix. It's a long-term game.
And that is, for example, giving teachers the time to read amazing articles like the ones I'm reading that you've written. They're giving you, because I've learned so much just reading all different articles from different writers, because they're, evidence informed is so important. So Nick, before we go for the news, do you think there's a danger that schools become focused on demonstrating improvement rather than achieving it? So it becomes a bit more performative, and the action behind it is not really there.
We have to demonstrate improvement, and there's no other way around it. That goes back to that point earlier about we have to hold in our minds two competing ideas. One is for when we're being judged, this was the situation, I did X, Y, and Z, and now this is the improved situation. We have to be able to talk about that, but we also have to understand that improvement doesn't work like that. And that we have to create conditions for it to happen, and then allow improvement to emerge. So it's definitely a danger, because it's the easier thing to understand as well, and it's the easier thing to satisfy our own need to think that we've got control over things that we might not have.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who've just joined, thank you so much. For those of you who've been with us from the start, thanks for staying with us. I'm sure you'll agree that tonight has been such an insightful session with Nick Hart we're talking about improvement, and that school improvement happens between the meetings, and looking at informal learning, not just for students, but also for teachers, and how school leaders can facilitate that. We're now going to break for the news, but do stay tuned, and please share your comments. Let's hear your thoughts. Ask a question. I'm sure Nick will be willing to answer your questions. Do stay tuned. We go for a short break and listen to the news.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today, and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
This week covers the news that Department for Education updated guidance says oversubscribed schools must not prioritise admitting pupils via managed moves over those already on their waiting lists, unless they better fit their criteria. The guidance is in its update around suspensions and permanent exclusions, which also includes a crackdown on off-rolling, removals for safeguarding reasons, and information tracking. The managed move guidance states that when transfers are taking place to an oversubscribed school, the pupil must not be admitted ahead of pupils on a waiting list where the school is operating one. Previous guidance said that parents should not be pressured into a managed move, but the new guidance explicitly says that a pupil must not be permanently excluded because of their parents' refusal to agree to a managed move. Trial managed moves are not allowed. Critical information sharing now must take place between the original and new school in all circumstances and in advance of the managed move. Further details, including examples of off-rolling, temporary removals for safeguarding reasons, directions off-site and pupil voice are all available online. Following a week of really hot weather, the TES magazine covers warnings from teaching bodies over concerns about the impact of extreme heat in classrooms. Research last year from the Department for Education found that without action, pupils could potentially lose up to 12 days of learning per year on average due to climate change, although these days did include days lost to flooding and other impacts of climate change beyond extreme heat. The Climate Change Committee published a report advocating the introduction of maximum temperature regulations in workplaces, which included schools and colleges. The CCC report says that taking an exam in 32 degrees C heat leads to around a 10% lower likelihood of passing, compared to a 22 degrees C day. The proposed target of 16 degrees to 25 degrees C is not due until 2050. Union reaction and more details can be found on TES magazine website. The BBC Northern Ireland news site reports on success for a pupil-run business. The company, set up and run by pupils at Park Special School, recently won 2 top prizes at the Young Enterprise Northern Ireland Awards. Their company, called Where's My Keys, makes and sells gifts, keyrings and sensory items. They used the £1,700 profit to buy every pupil in the school an Easter egg. The story contains lots of comment from the pupils involved and the impact of the project that's had on confidence, as well as learning about finance, branding and budgeting. Finally, the BBC African news site reports the sad news of the death of 16 students in a fire at a school in Kenya. The recent tragedy follows a string of deadly fires at boarding schools in recent years in the country. Authorities are investigating, but parents of the students have been questioning how prepared boarding schools are for fires and whether dormitories meet safety standards. In addition to the 16 fatalities, 79 students were injured. 800 children were in the school at the time of the fire. Full details on BBC News. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Thank you, Jo. A sad note to end the news on. I hope that the families have found strength. It's always interesting for me, Nick, to hear what's happening in the UK. And I think in a few years' time, they might need to invest in some air conditioning. They're concerned about 32 degrees heat. Oh, wow. Welcome back, everyone. And on our Twilight show tonight, I'm with Nick Hart, International Head Teacher, Researcher, Educator. We're talking about school improvement and the fact that it happens between the meetings. And we're focusing on informal learning of our teachers and making sure that leaders provide the culture that is conducive to that. So this is the final segment of the show, Nick, and thank you so much for all your insightful comments so far. So at this point in the show, I'd like to always go to the more practical advice that you could give those leaders who are listening. But before that, how can leaders tell whether their school culture is genuinely improving rather than simply becoming more compliant? Because we talked about those structures that people put in place for people to follow. This is how you introduce a lesson. This is how you develop the lesson. This is how you conclude, and other things. So how do we know that there's improvement and not just compliance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there are ways of understanding school culture that are more and more sophisticated. So stakeholder voice is always useful, particularly staff. So if you can provide an opportunity for anonymous ratings, comments on their opinions on how the school is run, I think that can be really powerful. That should be supplemented with direct conversation as well. I mean, we need to talk to to the people in our schools and find out how they're feeling about the work that we're doing. And it can be easy to forget that the higher up you are in a hierarchy in the school, the less likely it is you're going to hear the truth out of people, no matter how you try to create a great environment. The nature of hierarchy means that you're not going to hear the truth. Russell Hobby talks about the truth not rising to the top, but we have to have ways of understanding how people are feeling. But feeling is just one part of culture. So culture is also what people do and what they believe. So a shift in culture might, in terms of kind of sentiment, will have to come after a change in mindset. So you can have an idea on school culture about how people's beliefs are changing. If you're starting from a point where people don't value CPD or they don't see it as their job to improve, and then you start seeing incidents like the one you described of your colleague sharing an innovation, that's an indicator that school culture is improving, because you can see a shift in mindset, a shift in behavior. So we have to be attuned to those things. We have to kind of do the best we can at noticing what people think, what they believe, what they do, and how they feel. And all of those things contribute to culture. But unfortunately, sometimes we do the opposite, and we look and see if people are doing the thing that we want them to do. Are they doing a retrieval starter? Tick. Are they their books every lesson? Tick. That's not a reliable way of understanding what people are doing. That's just the things they want to show you. So it's definitely something that we have to be aware of, and it's a fundamental leadership requirement to know the difference between those things, and to understand what culture is and what compliance is, and how much compliance you're asking for and how much you're not. They are big decisions for leadership teams.
I learned earlier on in my career that whenever you decide to introduce an initiative, you must always think, what is the intended outcome, or what will be the impact? How will this impact on teaching and learning and student outcomes? And I remember many years ago, in one of the schools I taught in back in the UK, an initiative was introduced at the start of a term. And it was that students should do their starter activity at the back of their exercise books. And I kid you not, we had a whole CPD afternoon dedicated to that. I was asking, how will that impact on my students' outcomes and performance? And I was told, well, it will help them later on when they're revising. But I said, but it's detached from the learning, because it should be a natural progression in the books. And that fell apart eventually, because then the do-nows, starting at the back, started to meet up with the rest of the body of the work. And the students like, Miss, I have no space. So somebody went somewhere and saw this working in another environment, and they're right, let me superimpose this on this environment. It didn't work. So we just have to be mindful. And you're right.
We have to question.
Yeah. And then we spend time doing learning walks to check that everybody's doing their do now in the back of their books. I mean, but we live and we learn. Hopefully.
We do. Yeah. We do.
So bearing that in mind, what practical steps do you think leaders could take to strengthen informal learning and internal accountability within their schools? Maybe one or two ideas.
Yeah, I mean, so we have to get a good idea, informal learning about what, and internal accountability of what. And I think like what is the biggest thing that drives improvement? It's great teaching. So schools don't get better unless the teaching is brilliant. And so if we want informal learning about great teaching, we have to have internal accountability about pinning down what that is, or at least the boundaries of what it could involve. So we might go down the route of dictating what great teaching is. We can go proper teach like a champion and have everyone doing the same techniques, or we could just say, look, here's a load of evidence about what great teaching is. We reduce cognitive load. We introduce things in small steps. Here's Rose and Shine. Here's the walkthroughs. Here's Kennedy's Passing the Practice and give people access to the stuff and let it happen. So there's all sorts of ways of doing it, but people aren't going to learn informally about great teaching unless we are holding ourselves accountable for sharing what we believe that is. And we have to make decisions about how much we give and how much we specify, which is a massive leadership decision. And then there's so if we've got something to think with, if we've got people who can talk about the content because of that internal accountability, we've got to make sure they've got capacity to do that. So have they got opportunities to talk about it now, or are we just sending it to them for them to read and hoping that it sticks? So are we swapping out that weekly time to work in triads and talk? Are we making that time, make sure there's time in the timetable for team teaching to happen, or visiting each other's classrooms regularly? Are we removing the barriers to getting into someone else's classroom and then talking about it? Like the capacity thing is huge. If we want mixing to happen, they've got to do it at some point during the day, but then how? So the practical steps are timetabling, making it happen, pairing people up, trying to make it as easy as possible for them to have those conversations. So we need something to talk about, and we need the actual opportunity to talk. They're the practical things. And if we spent the money and time that we did on formal CPD training, buying in external speakers or sending people on courses on that, we could make a big difference.
Totally agree. And so if improvement is non-linear, how should leaders rethink their expectations of teacher growth and school development? And you mentioned this earlier as well, that it's not linear. So,
And I think it comes down to the idea of planning for emergence. So emergence is the alternative, the antidote to non-linear, to linear improvement. The idea that in a complex system, the new behaviors, new actions, new ideas, new beliefs come out naturally from those interactions. So to plan for that to happen is paying closer to conditions, the conditions that are required for emergence to happen, which is collisions, people bumping into each other, having something to talk about, and that's not easy to comprehend. So, but we have to. The starting point is really understanding that not all teacher learning happens in those CPD sessions where you think it does because you're the one doing the presenting. That's fundamental to any of this is letting go of the ego of thinking that people are learning from you because you're standing up in front of everyone talking once a week. That's not where it happens. And so our expectations of teacher growth and school development has to come from understanding how teachers get better.
Thank you so much. And that leads us to the final reflection, Nick, which you've already dipped into a little bit. But if you were to give a final message to leaders across the world, because trust me, I've got people listening as far away as Jamaica, Romania, you name it. Yeah. So you are impacting a lot of people tonight, Nick. In your view, what does genuine school improvement look like? And what is the biggest misconception school leaders need to challenge in order to ensure improvement? So just give us your final reflection. Sum it up. What's your final message to school leaders?
I think the best leaders can code switch. So I think they can tell the story of linear improvement when they need to. It was like this, then we did that, and now it's better. But they also can leave that alone when the inspectors aren't around and plan for emergence, where they get a really clear idea of what great teaching is, work on trusting relationships, make sure there's capacity to do those things, and to be able to switch between the two, to hold those two competing ideas contradictory ideas in their minds at the same time, and to know when to switch between the two. That code switching is the one, I think.
Thank you so much, Nick. If I must say so myself, one of the best shows I've had. Thank you for joining us on Teachers Talk Radio, for sharing with us, for shedding some more light on the article and giving us more insight into what improvement should look like and how, as leaders, we can facilitate that. And just to sum up, there's so many takeaways. I've got lots of notes here, but I'm going to try and do this in a nutshell. So for those of you who've been online listening, thank you so much. I really appreciate your company tonight. And Nick talked about the fact that the school system is really complex, and that's something we need to recognize. And therefore, it is important to understand the context before we introduce any kind of initiative. We need to make sure that we understand what informal learning is all about, and how valuable it is, and giving teachers the time to have those conversations. But he said they also need to know what the conversations will be about, and not being judged for having those conversations, because that's where they learn the most. He talked about having internal accountabilities, and this is where leaders come into play, where they have to make sure that their internal systems that will ensure accountability. Throughout the show, Nick emphasized that great teaching results in great outcomes. And for great teaching to take place, leaders need to provide the structure and all that is needed for great teaching to take place. And that is giving teachers the platform to develop themselves, to learn from each other, and having those informal conversations, and not thinking that the CPDs are the be all and end all, and that teachers are actually learning from these CPDs, but it's being reflective and looking at the system as a whole. He talked about making sure that there's time, whether we work in or triads, whether, how do we pair people up, and making sure that we get the time to have those conversations. And at the end, Nick encouraged us to plan for emergence, thinking about new behaviors, new ideas, that these things come naturally. And most importantly, as leaders, we need to learn to code switch in order to plan for these emergence, to code switch, to know when something isn't working, to stop, to assess or reassess, and to then devise other strategies to ensure improvement, to ensure greater outcomes. Thank you all for joining us, and do share this podcast with others. And I'll see you soon on our next episode on Teachers Talk Radio, the Wednesday Twilight Show. Nick, thank you so much once again for joining, and all the best in your new and exciting endeavor.
Thank you, Michelle.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.